going to go ahead and get started. This webinar is being recorded. A link to the recording and a PDF of the slides will be available on NSLA's website and on the National Academies of Sciences website, where you can also download the full report. The recording link and PDF will also be sent out to all registered participants. Hello and welcome again. My name is Leslie Gabay-Swanston. I'm the Director of Program and Systems Quality at the National Summer Learning Association. Thank you for joining us for the third webinar in our winter webinar series. Here's an overview of our webinar today. First, I'll share a little bit about NSLA for those who are unfamiliar. Then we'll hear from our panelists from the National Academies of Sciences Study Committee, and we'll have some time for the questions to the panel, and then wrap up with some announcements. As we're going through, feel free to type your questions in the Q&A box. We'll try to catch them if they're in the chat box, but they might get lost. So please try to use the Q&A box if you'd like for your question to be asked and answered live. So a little bit about NSLA. The National Summer Learning Association is the only national nonprofit exclusively focused on addressing the achievement gap by increasing access to high-quality summer learning opportunities. NSLA's goal is to increase nationwide the number of high-quality summer learning programs. To achieve this goal, NSLA recognizes and disseminates what works, offers expertise and support for programs and communities, and advocates for summer learning as a solution for equity and excellence in education. NSLA's work is driven by the belief that all children and youth deserve high-quality summer learning experiences that will help them succeed in college, career, and life. Core to our work is the recognition that high-quality summer learning works. High-quality summer learning programs have been shown to improve reading and math skills, school attachment, motivation, and relationships with adults and peers. So why does NSLA believe so strongly in summer? We know that summer is a time of great inequity for young people, and we believe that promoting and supporting summer opportunities is the way to address this. Summer is a time of innovation and exploration. Without some of the constraints of the school year, kids are able to try different ways of learning, interact with other adults and peers that they might not otherwise. It's also a time for innovation for our adults, whether that's opportunities for professional development, trying new teaching methods, or exploring new partnerships. Today we are honored to feature the Shaping Summertime Experiences Report. Sponsored by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and the Wallace Foundation, the National Academies of Sciences and Engineering and Medicine convened a committee of experts in 2018 to study and prepare a report on the state of the sciences on how summertime experiences affect school-age children across education, health, and safety. Last year, the report was released and put forth a number of recommendations to inform federal, state, local, and organizational decision makers on developing programs and policies to support the healthy development and learning of all children during the summer months. We welcome 3 of the committee members here today to speak on the recommendations, what actions practitioners can take, and areas for future research. It's my pleasure to introduce Carl Alexander, John Dewey Professor Emeritus of Sociology at Johns Hopkins University, Nancy Deutsch, Professor and Director of Youth Next at the University of Virginia, and Chris Smith, President and Executive Director of Boston After School and Beyond. With that, I will turn things over to Chris to get us started.
Thanks, Leslie, and thanks everybody for joining today. It's my pleasure to kick off today's webinar, and I want to thank the National Summer Learning Association for hosting this. I'm going to cover a little bit of ground up front on this report, which hopefully you've seen by now, if not downloaded. I'll cover the statement of task or the charge for the committee, talk about who the committee members were and where they came from, talk a little bit about the methodology and our approach to this, as well as our systems perspective. And then we'll get into some of the review and recommendations. So first, this report was sponsored by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and the Wallace Foundation. And our committee's statement of task or charge was to examine the summertime experiences of school-age children across 4 areas of well-being. The first was academic learning and opportunities for enrichment. The second was social and emotional development. The third was physical and mental health and health promoting behaviors. And finally, we took a look at safety, risk-taking, in both anti and pro-social behaviors. And the way we went about this was to review the literature on summertime in the context of these 4 domains. And in doing so, came up with a set of recommendations to improve the experiences of children and youth over the summertime in order to improve their healthy development and learning and to reduce risky behaviors. Additionally, we took a look at gaps in the research and made suggestions for future research, which we'll get to toward the end of today's webinar. And I should note that we had a few areas of particular focus, including the developmental trajectories of children and youth during the summer, the availability and accessibility of these programs, as well as the gaps for children during the summer. We also took a look at policies that either increase or decrease programs and experiences for children and youth during the summer, and population-based disparities in the impact of summer on these developmental trajectories, program access, and effectiveness. And you might ask, what's the value of this study and what does it add to what we already have and know? And this is really the first study that was done in a cross-sector way. And I'm just trying to advance the slide, so if you'll be patient with me, we'll get to the next one. There we go. So now we're into the committee members. I mentioned that this was done in a cross-sectoral way. The committee was comprised of 13 people. You can see their names here, including my colleagues, Carl and Nancy. There are 13 of us, and we came from different sectors, including education, juvenile justice, medicine, the business community, of course, out-of-school time programming, psychology, public health, public policy, sociology, urban planning, and youth development. So we came from a number of different perspectives in order to shape this report. And just a bit about the methodology as well. We had several in-person closed session meetings. We had 5 of them where we'd deliberate on the findings and the conclusions and the recommendations. But we also had public information sessions where we heard from experts in areas such as rural health, human services, justice, on American Indian health, and also from the private sector. We, of course, conducted a rather extensive review of the literature against our charge in the 4 areas of priority. And we commissioned memos from knowledgeable stakeholder organizations as well. And we also obtained information from all 3 levels of government, the federal, state, and municipal levels, on programs and policies that were relevant to our charge and more generally to opportunities for children and youth. We had papers commissioned on international programs, as well as for kids and juvenile justice, in child welfare, on policing, and looking at different geographies to look at their particular effect on the summertime experiences of youth. And you've heard me say a couple of times, and it's worth noting that our approach was that of a systems perspective. And what we mean by that are intersecting social contexts that pose barriers and also present opportunities to the healthy academic, social, and emotional development of our nation's most needy children. And some examples of what we mean by system are kids in social contexts, kids living in low resource areas, high poverty areas, kids with particular needs, healthcare needs, kids in the juvenile justice system. So at all points, we looked at how summer in the intersection of where kids spend their time with whom in different systems and how that affects them. So this is a fairly comprehensive look from multiple perspectives at what young people experience. And where that landed us were in the contents of the report. So you'll see that we have the landscape of summertime experiences for young people in America. We took a look at the effects of those summertime experiences on kids' development. And we looked at how some of those programs actually influence outcomes for young people. And of course, we looked at the circumstances from which kids came against each of those objectives. Our audience for this report are decision makers at the federal level, at the state level, the local level, and also nonprofit and philanthropic leaders who want to make a difference in this area. That's an overview of the report. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Nancy Deutsch from the University of Virginia, who's going to talk a little bit about summertime risks and opportunities. Nancy?
Great, thank you, Chris. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our view of summertime. So the summer months present a major departure from the structure, resources, and support systems that are available to the vast majority of children, youth, and their parents during the traditional school year. So for those with few economic resources and with limited income, the opportunity to continue school year experiences in the 4 domains of academic learning, social and emotional development, physical and mental health, and pro-social behavior is often constrained. So this contributes to differential summertime experiences for children and youth based on their socioeconomic status, which can result in losses in some domains, gains in some domains, and a lack of progress in others. So the diverse socio-environmental settings in which children and youth live, play, and work determine the availability of and accessibility to programs and services during the summer months. And it's important to note that availability and accessibility are 2 different things. So when schools close for the summer, children, youth, and families may lose a number of vital supports, such as access to healthy meals, access to medical care, daily supervision, and structured enrichment opportunities. These losses make summer a time of increased vulnerability for many children and youth, especially those from communities and families with fewer resources. While children from higher and middle income families may not be affected by these losses, many families with fewer resources cannot fill this gap. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the overarching report findings. So, and I'm going to focus in this case on the first 3 of these. Basic developmental needs really must be met in order for children to thrive. We know that children need adequate nutrition and safety for health and social emotional stimulation to support psychological and cognitive development. So these needs do not pause during the summer. Access to diverse opportunities during the summertime is influenced by a broad range of factors, including family income, parent work status, family structure, and geography. So the most vulnerable children, those in households or neighborhoods at the lower socioeconomic level, and youth and families from ethnic, racial, or immigrant minority backgrounds, youth with special needs or disabilities, from rural neighborhoods, or youth who are LGBTQ+, are affected by the juvenile or adult criminal justice or child welfare systems, face the greatest challenges in accessing quality summertime experiences. So placing our call for action and investments for greater equity in positive summertime experiences for children and youth into the broader context of the distinct cultures, histories, and assets that they possess as members of families and communities is an important part of what we discuss. So interventions that may result from our recommendation should leverage those capacities in their design and implementation. And you'll note that we also discussed the research on summertime, which my colleague Carl Alexander will talk about in a little bit. So the following are some select recommendations that we will offer thematically. So the first we'll talk about is improving availability, access, and equity. So barriers to accessing public and private services and institutions can affect some groups of children disproportionately, as I've mentioned. And as we talked about, this includes children affected by parental incarceration, children who experience homelessness, children involved in juvenile justice systems. But at the same time, many communities' access to developmentally supportive and enriching summer experiences is dependent on parents' financial standing. As a result, summertime can increase inequity if children from wealthier backgrounds who live in better served communities participate in such experiences, while their peers from less financially secure families and underserved communities, in other words, communities where they may face barriers to accessing resources and services, do not. Thus, for a wide variety of developmental needs and outcomes, summertime actually widens the gap between children and youth in underserved communities and their peers in well-served communities. Yet this period of summer also presents opportunities to close these gaps. Viewed through an equity frame, summer provides an opportunity for communities to ensure that all youth, every young person, has access to experiences and settings that support their developmental assets. So one of the recommendations we make is to reduce food insecurity for children and youth during the summer. So adequate nutrition and safety, we know, are necessary to support healthy development. In the summer, weight gain accelerates and access to school-based food and nutrition programs is cut, which leads to increased risk of food insecurity, making the reduction of food insecurity during the summer months an imperative. For example, in 2014, 84% of students who received free and reduced price meals during the school year did not receive meals from the Summer Food Service Program or other summer nutrition programs run by the USDA. Therefore, we think it is imperative to increase access to the Summer Food Service Program and reduce barriers to community eligibility for the program, so expanding the Summer Electronic Benefits Transfer for Children program. I'm trying to, there we go. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Chris, for some more on employment.
Thanks, Nancy. In addition to food insecurity, we had a recommendation around promoting summer employment. And specifically, the committee recommends that we increase funding for structured summer employment programs in order to serve more adolescents. And this would involve the federal, state, and city officials partnering with the private sector to do so that they could increase funding and in doing so, create more opportunities. Why did we focus on employment? A couple of reasons. One is that one conclusion was that the private sector is particularly well positioned to have an impact on summer experiences in a couple of ways. One way is by being an employer of young people themselves, hiring them directly or in subsidized programs. The other is by promoting family-friendly policies and corporate social responsibility policies and initiatives that engage children and youth during the summer. And that conclusion and the related recommendation is bolstered by the research on summer employment. We uncovered several robust studies of city-run programs that braid together federal, state, city dollars in addition to private sector dollars in order to employ young people. And what we found was these are done for randomized controlled trials. So they're experimental designs, they're robust studies in big cities, New York, Chicago, and Boston. We found that there is a reduction in violence and positive benefits for the young people themselves. So we feel strongly about that recommendation. Another, I mentioned that we took a systems approach that necessarily looked across sectors. The fact that we are dealing with so many different actors in the summer space necessitates a recommendation around improving the planning, administration, and coordination of summer programs and services. And so to that end, our recommendation is that we augment funding, technology, and in-kind supports to intermediaries who are working specifically in this summertime space. And the full recommendation recommends that foundations and other philanthropic organizations take the lead in augmenting their funding and support so that intermediaries can continue to create the systems, the platforms, the engagement, and the communication vehicles for promoting promising and effective practices and focusing explicitly on the summer months. In many communities, intermediaries play a role in generating and coordinating resources, in capturing, analyzing, making good use of data, and in mobilizing opportunities for young people and tracking their effectiveness. And you can see here that we've listed some well-known examples of intermediaries, including at the national level, the After School Alliance, the Forum for Youth Investment, the National Summer Learning Association, and the National After School Association. I'd add the Every Hour Counts network of cities, of which we're a part, and of course, local intermediaries, which are starting to sprout all around the country in order to play that coordinating role. And I'd like now to turn it back to Carl Alexander, who's going to talk a little bit about the influence and effectiveness of summer programs. Carl?
There we go. Thank you, Chris. So in the next few minutes, we're going to be talking about the report's coverage of the evidence on the effectiveness of summer programs for children and youth, and also on the availability of data systems, primarily federal and state, for monitoring the experiences of children and youth over the summer months. We undertook a thoroughgoing assessment of the intervention or evaluation literature on summer programs, adopting very rigorous standards of proof before making judgments. So to inform our review, we adapted the standards of proof guidelines from the Every Student Succeeds Act. These are quite rigorous. If you're not familiar with that, I'll take just a minute to mention just a couple of the four instances. To conclude that a program is conclusively effective, that is, the differences between comparison and intervention groups could be traced to the experience of being in the program, required a study that included random assignment to intervention and control conditions, a large sample size of at least 350, and that the research be conducted in more than one site. Not many of the studies that we identified in our review were able to satisfy those standards. More often, the studies that we examined were able to support conclusions that were moderate confidence in that the program differences traced to the experience of the program and suggestive evidence. So we're talking mainly about moderate and suggestive evidence. There were two limitations to this entire body of literature that I want to mention. First is that the evidence is really quite thin on program effectiveness overall. We identified a total of 67 studies. That seems like a goodly number. But 48 of those 67 were focused on academic outcomes, and 37 of the 48 were focused on reading or language arts specifically. So there were just a handful of studies that addressed issues of socio-emotional learning. We identified 11. Just 5 studies that addressed issues of physical and mental health, and 3 studies on what we refer to as problem behaviors, things like drug use, safe sex, and crime avoidance. So the evidence base here isn't as encompassing as we would like it to be in terms of the 4 domains that commanded the report's attention, and also the population groups that were well represented in these studies were very limited. Most of this research focuses on the experiences of children in low-income families and African-American children, contrasted with the experiences of majority white children. So there, after a bit, I'll say something about the other vulnerable student populations, children and youth populations that are not well represented in this literature. But for now, it's sufficient to say that most of the evidence we have speaks to the experiences of African-American and low-income youth. So those are the limitations. But in point of fact, there's some good news in this review of the literature, in that we found evidence of program effectiveness for each of the 4 domains. The evidence was most abundant for academic programs and for reading specifically, but indeed we found programs that appeared to be effective in supporting healthy student development in each of the outcome domains that were considered by the committee. I'm going to try to use my slide. Now, I got to advance the slide. Let me see how to do this. No, I may need some help here. Oh, there it goes. So to recap, these are the 4 domains. Unfortunately, I don't have the time to go into the details of studies in each of these, other than to say that the results were encouraging. That's not to say that every study produced evidence of demonstrable impact. And in fact, even in some studies, the program seemed to be more impactful for some outcomes than for others. One of the considerations there, and I'll go to the next slide. I'm going in the wrong direction, I'm sorry. Okay. So the review of the literature seemed to support several conclusions, and these could be thought of as best practice recommendations. Focus on underserved youth and children beyond the experiences of African-American children and low-income families. Target the specific needs of participants. That is, programs that seem to be most effective are ones that demonstrated intentionality. They had clear program goals for the outcomes under consideration and were organized in a way that were intended to support those program goals. The research suggests as well, and this is from the quantitative studies as well as from the qualitative that we looked at, that it's important that the program organization be developmentally and culturally appropriate for the youth being served. One size does not fit all. Another recommendation was in the evaluation area specifically that the program should identify specific outcomes and measurements that are key to those outcomes. So for example, I mentioned that not all programs proved to be effective for all outcomes that were considered in a particular study. So if you have a program that's focused on something like boosting reading comprehension, and you decide to do an evaluation that includes a test of reading comprehension and also a questionnaire focused on socio-emotional learning, and you'll find that the results are disappointing in the area of socio-emotional learning, should that be considered a negative conclusion? Well, if the program wasn't designed to support socio-emotional learning, then perhaps not. So just as there ought to be intentionality in the way the program is organized, there should also be intentionality in the evaluation, such that what's being evaluated is linked in a clear way to program goals. Another consideration that stood out in our review of the literature is the importance of promoting strong attendance. If children are not coming to the program on a regular basis, the likelihood of effectiveness, program effectiveness is greatly diminished. Related to that, we have to be sure that programs are accessible to the target children, youth, and families. Issues such as program expense and transportation enlarged in that regard. And finally, it was concluded that programs to be effective have to be of sufficient duration to meet the desired outcome. Now, there's no clear-cut critical threshold for duration, but the suggestion in those studies that we reviewed is that programs of at least 5 weeks duration seem to stand out. Program that's shorter than that has less opportunity to really be impactful. I want to return, since I've said some critical things about what's in the literature and in particular what's not in the literature, I want to return to the good news, and that is that we have evidence, and it's evidence that we believe is well supported by our review of the literature, that programmatic interventions in supporting children in the 4 domains that were the focus of the committee's attention can and have proven to be effective in meeting program goals. So that's the good news. We just need more of that kind of research, but it's there. As I've said, we looked as carefully as we could and as thoroughly as we could at programs that were focused on the 4 domains. and found that by and large, the research that was available was concentrated on the academic domain. There's a pressing need for high quality research at the same levels of quality that we saw in the literature on these other outcome domains. So I want to turn now to the, again, I'm going in the wrong direction, I apologize. Data systems. In the committee's charge, we looked long and hard at data that allow us to describe in detail the summertime experiences of children and youth in the 4 domains, developmental domains that were at issue. Sadly, I have to say, the federal and state level data gathering apparatuses that we turn to very rarely identify the summertime experiences of children. That is, you had limited abilities to focus in specifically on summertime. And that was a severe limitation, and we found very few exceptions to that in our coverage of issues. In fact, one of the best sources that we found was some of you may be familiar with this, was the publication America After 3 p.m. A survey that was conducted in 2009 by the After School Alliance. That was 2009. There was a summer supplement to the survey that year. The focus of that report is primarily on after school, not summer. So we really did find it challenging to be able to characterize at the level of detail that we should the summertime experiences of children and youth in these various domains of development. And in particular, what was lacking was good coverage of the disadvantaged student populations beyond children in lower income families and African American youth. The study's coverage was intended to embrace American Indian children, Alaska Native children, Native Hawaiian children, Pacific Islanders, immigrant, migrant, and refugee children, homeless children, children in the child welfare and juvenile justice systems, LGBTQ children, and children with special health care and developmental needs. Now that's a long list, and I don't expect you to be able to take it in as I'm just going through it. But the point is that these vulnerable and needy populations have been substantially neglected in this literature, and it's very hard. We don't have the kind of understanding of their experiences over the summer months that we would want to have in order to inform high quality programming for them and to address their needs. So in terms of data systems and data gatherings, we've identified several federal agencies that could do a better job of this. And this is not an exhaustive list, it's just several of many possibilities. So the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the National Institutes of Health, and Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration should tell us more about summer-specific morbidity, mortality, behavioral risk factors, and risk-taking behaviors. The National Center for Education Statistics should make available to us data that tracks summer-specific academic learning, social and emotional learning, and other outcomes. The Department of Justice should create and maintain a database that tracks summer-specific youth police encounters, crime, victimization, and delinquency. And as in this slide, the Department of Education's 21st Century Community Learning Center data gathering should also specify the experiences of children and youth over the summer months. So in terms of need to know, we've got a long way to go. So by way of summary, there are a lot of research needs. And the ones that are enumerated here on this slide are important, but they're hardly exhaustive. So in terms of data tracking of children over the summer months, we know very little about what experiences any given summer, and even less about their developmental trajectories over time. As I've already mentioned, there's high quality research on effectiveness of programs and practices, but different for a variety of needy populations are neglected. Many needy populations have been neglected in that research, and with the exception of the academic programming, the evidence base is not as robust as we would like it to be. We need to know more about the time use of children and youth. The literature needs to be more revealing of the experiences of underserved populations. And then across the board, there's a lot to be learned about the 4 developmental domains that are the focus of the committee's report: academic learning and enrichment, social-emotional development, physical and mental health, and then safety, risk-taking, and anti and pro-social behaviors. So on the research and data front, we have there's a research foundation, a research base that encourages us to think that we know how to do effective programming to support children's development, healthy development. We need to do more of that work. In terms of the data gathering at the federal and state levels, there's a pressing need to launch data gathering initiatives that are summer specific. Going in the wrong direction again, I think. Okay, so just to wrap up, actually, I'm returning to some remarks that Nancy made way back in when we began the webinar. The summertime experience is a window of opportunity, and it's also a time of risk for many children, youth, and families. When schools are closed for the year, and families, needy families in particular, have to rely on their own resources and the resources available to them in their communities to continue the healthy development of their children. Many of them are lacking in the resources and experiences that are needed to move their children forward. Often these families will miss out on a number of vital supports that they can count on during the school year: access to healthy meals, access to medical care, daily adult supervision, and access to safe and structured enrichment and learning opportunities will keep their children moving forward. Parents of means, middle-class parents with professional careers, can provide these experiences and opportunities for their children. Needy parents may need their help, and that's one of the messages that we hope this report will deliver loud and clear. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl, Chris, and Nancy, for that great overview of the report and your work in bringing it together. So we have some time now for questions from our audience. If you have a question, please feel free to type it in the Q&A box, and we will ask it live to our panelists. We do have a question right here, and you touched on this a little bit, Carl, but what research findings do you wish advocates shared more, focused on more? What makes a strong case for summer learning, yet we're not talking about enough for the general public and or elected officials to know?
So I'll jump in really quickly and note that I think one of the cases that maybe we don't make enough for summer programs overall is, I think, the role that they have in meeting basic developmental needs. So I think that we do sometimes try to make the argument about, academic learning or stopping the summer slide. But when you look at the research on physical and mental health, we can really see that there is a role for summer programs in meeting those basic needs around food security, for example. And I think that there are very strong arguments to be made for supporting programs not to say that that's all they do, but that is a base need, and then we can build from there. But that we certainly can't expect kids to thrive in the summer months if their basic needs aren't even being met. And that's a starting point for arguments for summer programs. And I expect my colleagues want to weigh in as well.
Well, I'm happy to weigh in and to echo Nancy's sentiment. In point of fact, in the evaluation literature, no one evaluated whether summer programs are keeping children safe or whether summer programs are providing nutritious meals. Those should be givens, and every child is deserving of a safe space to spend the summer, especially children who are living in high poverty, perhaps crime-ridden neighborhoods. They deserve a safe and secure place with adult supervision to care for them and to have access to nutritious meals. The question that was posed, though, is a challenging one. As I said in the review of the literature, the research is most abundant for in the academic domain, and especially for reading programs. And if one wants to make the case that we need more of this kind of work, you can certainly point to the supportive literature to make that case. That is, we can do well this kind of programming and help boost children's academic preparation and have them return to school in the fall ready to hit the ground running and be better prepared for the work ahead. What we would like to know more fully and in greater detail than we do now is the opportunities for programming in these other domains. And they often are off the radar screen, it seems to me. There's a small literature on summer camps that are designed specifically for children who are recovering from traumatic experiences and have particular developmental or health needs. Those camps are providing a tremendous service to the children and their families, but they don't get the kind of attention that they deserve, and there ought to be more of them. So I think to answer the question, there's a lot of ammunition in this report that can be used for advocates and for program planners who want to make the case the value of what they're doing. But at the same time, I would say that we really need to continue to develop the base of evidence that will help strengthen that argument.
Thank you. We have another question. Can you define pro-social and antisocial behaviors a little further?
Yeah, so I'll start and my colleagues can jump in. So antisocial behaviors are typically things like aggression, bullying, right? So things that are differentiated from what we might typically define as risk-taking behaviors, which are often things like, unprotected sex, substance use. So antisocial behaviors are things that are, not necessarily risk-taking, but that we would not consider, say, positive in relationship to one's peers, aggression, bullying. And then pro-social behaviors are something that we don't always focus as much on in the field of youth development. So I am a developmentalist. I consider myself a youth development researcher, but I think we often focus on the negatives, on risk-taking and antisocial behaviors. And we try to also think about pro-social behaviors. So that could be things like volunteering or community service, right? Character connection, the sort of competencies and positive behaviors that young people engage in as well.
Just as a reminder, if you have any questions for our panelists, please go ahead and type those into the Q&A box.
And while we wait, Leslie, in terms of the first question about the research findings, I didn't wish for more focus on any particular research necessarily. One thing that struck me was the invisibility of the summer months to policymakers. It's just not on our screen to track what kids have access to, what they participate in, how they feel about those opportunities, what they want more of, what services they access, how well fed they are, how safe they feel. We just don't track that on a systematic basis in America. Some cities attempt to do this, but it's not part of how we look at things. When you consider all the attention the school year gets, it's amazing that we leave 15% of the year uncovered in those respects. So that's not research, it's tracking.
Yeah, I want to echo that, Chris. And I think, in many ways we may say it's actually not surprising, given that during the school year, the vast majority of kids, we know where they are. They are in the formal school system. And so in some ways, the tracking mechanisms are easier to build in. In many communities, the summer months, the experiences are so much more disparate because there is no universal summer intervention. And so you need to be much more intentional around how you gather that information. You don't just have kids in the school and therefore can track it. So I think Chris is really right. We have not had really good systematic ways of doing that. And it's really important, but it's going to take a lot of intentionality to do well.
So I would just add, it's important to recognize that the organization of summer is vastly different for children and for families for that matter than is the organization of the school year. So children are often in a much less structured environment. They have more free time. And in some of the domains that were the focus of our attention, that lack of structure and increase in free time raises very serious questions about the experiences that wouldn't necessarily map or mirror the experiences that you would expect to see during the school year. So for example, in terms of our literature review, we looked long and hard for evidence in the criminal justice domain, whether problem encounters with the police increased during the summer months when more children were out and about and on the streets and some absent adult supervision. We couldn't find that evidence. We couldn't find those data. And that's such a fundamental thing that we'd want to know, and yet it's just not there. It really was shocking, I would say. And this is just one example of the data tracking systems that are in place that don't allow you to isolate the summertime specifically.
Yeah. I just want to note one more thing. I see we have another question, so I want to let us get to that. But I also wanted to note, as we talked about structure and the lack of structure in summer, and I know that Carl mentioned towards the end of the report about structured, about academic learning and but I also want to note that I think as a committee, we are not arguing that unstructured time is not important, right? So I think we also recognize that developmentally children and youth need unstructured time and need time to play. But one differentiation we did make was between structure and supervision, right? And so we need to think about balances of structured time and unstructured time, but a need for also appropriate supervision. And so I also want to make clear that we are not arguing that all, 100% of kids' summer's time should mirror the school year, that summer provides unique opportunities. But we need to be intentional about ensuring that all kids have enrichment opportunities as well. It's not just remediation.
Great. We have another question about the literature. Within the research, was there any literature on STEM-specific academic programming? You mentioned much of the literature was focused on reading or language arts.
Yeah, so there were studies of STEM outcomes, but I can't say that they were allowed us to draw conclusions about the differences between STEM-focused summer program interventions versus as opposed to programs that were not inherently STEM-focused. So I think we have reason to believe that we can design programs that would advance children's STEM competence or learning or engagement. But I'm not sure beyond that, what exactly were you hoping to learn? So there is research on STEM. There is evidence of program effectiveness in the STEM domains. Was there
yeah, much more narrowly, if you just take the M part of STEM, math, one of the biggest studies out there on voluntary summer learning programs conducted by RAND over the past 5 or 6 years showed strong effects in math in the fall immediately after summer. That's documented in Ready for Fall. I think that was 2014. And then in its 2016 report, Learning from Summer, RAND documented that participants outperformed their non-participating peers in math after the second summer. through the subsequent spring. So narrowly, the M part of STEM appeared in 2 recent studies. And as Carl said, STEM as a content approach was part of other studies as well.
We have another question about libraries. Were public library summer learning programs a factor in this research?
That's an interesting question. And the short answer is no, and the longer answer is no, unfortunately. Its tendency is to think that academically focused summer programs are going to be either going to be school-based, or perhaps in programs that are sponsored by various other nonprofit organizations and program providers. But in point of fact, summer programming for reading and for other outcomes can be situated in lots of very different places, and there's a very robust interest in the library community on summer programming for reading and other outcomes. Unfortunately, we could not identify any library-based programs that satisfied the standards of proof that we adopted for our literature review. And so what I would say is that, yes, indeed, libraries are a great place to do this good work. And if we want to say with confidence what it is about the library programming that really is working, we would need to recommend that the commitment to high quality evaluation research within the library context. It simply wasn't there.
Going along with that, what data elements would you suggest be collected at a state level to better evaluate summer learning programs and summer experiences?
Are you speaking specifically with respect to academic performance or more generally?
I think let's start with all areas.
So
more generally.
One thing I'll note is, I think, as we were talking about, is that we don't even have very good data on availability and access necessarily in terms of general summer experiences of young people. Mm-hmm. And I think that is an equity issue. There's really interesting work being done in different sectors around sort of public data and equity atlas data for communities. And I think that could be a really valuable tool for people in the summertime field to think about how to look at, where there are summer programs, where there aren't summer programs, and where there are programs, who is accessing those in terms of experiences. And states, I think, could be helpful in helping local communities map that more effectively, although I think that's more Chris's domain than mine, so he may want to add. And I think, I'll just add a quick note. I think my gut is that one of the reasons that we know more about the academic domain than others is that schools tend to do end of year assessments and beginning of year assessments, right, in the academic domain. And so we can leverage that to understand how summer programs are working. So if we as an education system took a broader view of what we wanted to be understanding about young people's holistic development, and we were measuring those along with academic outcomes in the spring and in the fall, we would also by default have more information about these other domains in terms of summer, although there's more specific things we can do, and I'll let my colleagues talk a little bit now about that.
Yeah, I think the most basic and useful data elements would be who is enrolled, to what extent do they attend, and what are the characteristics of those programs. And that would go for the local level too. I think that could be either at the local or state level. Sounds simple, more challenging to do given the disparate players involved in this, how you would track it. We happen to do that in the city of Boston by collaborating with individual programs, all of whom agree to share their data so that we can get a more comprehensive view of who's participating. And from there, you can imagine all the collaboration and how they might work together to ensure that they serve kids who otherwise wouldn't find their way to programs and that they can get better together. But I think just starting with basic enrollment and attendance would be great for a state to track.
I think we have time for one more question. What should program providers who are providing direct services to students and families take away from this report, or what can they do now to help advance the recommendations?
One thing I think that we did talk a lot about, so one is, I think, again, I feel like we're hammering this home, but access, access, access. So really thinking about who is your program not just available to, but who can really access it, and that those are two different things. And what can you as a program do to better serve those children and youth in your surrounding communities who may not have access to other high quality programs. I think all programs, we mentioned summer nutrition programs. I think every program, if they're not already enrolled, should look into being the summer nutrition sites, right? Try to increase food security. And then we had a lot of discussions around sort of cultural responsiveness of programs and really ensuring that if you are working directly with youth, that you are not just conscious of, but responsive to the specific cultural needs and backgrounds of the youth and the families that you're working with, because that also is going to increase access, right? Families and children and families are more likely to want to be part of and to try to access programs if they feel that they are welcoming places for them.
Are there any last thoughts that you'd like to share, our panel would like to share with our audience?
Well, I would just like to say those of you who are listening in are heroes. I mean, this is important work, and it's generally not as well appreciated and certainly not as well supported as it needs to be. And so if you're a program provider, then by all means, there's useful information in the report that could benefit you in terms of what the report is able to say about best practices. If you're a person who's involved in policy or aspires to influencing policy, there's a lot of content in the report that you could take away to serve as in your advocacy work. There is a pressing need to know that I think the report has worked hard and did a good job of organizing the information that was available to it. But there are just so many gaps in the literature coverage and so many things that we would like to know in order to do our work better that isn't presently available. That having folks out there that are kind of leading the charge and working hard in the advocacy and policy front to do better than we've done in the past is very important. And I think that our report provides considerable ammunition for those of you who want to do that hard work.
And I would just add to reinforce one of Carl's earlier points about programs being intentional about the duration of the program, who they staff it with, who they hope to attract, as Nancy said. That's all in running a good program. But to have a greater influence in part of a summer sector, I'd say try to join up with other programs so that you can learn from one another in your particular approaches, and because you have a stronger presence when you're working together, when you are trying to influence policy at the city, state, and federal levels. This report is calling out what should be done by various actors, but it doesn't mean that we have to wait for it to be done by them to start making progress on this issue.
Great, thank you. Thank you for all your questions, everybody, and thank you to our panelists for sharing your knowledge and insight. I'm going to wrap up with just a few announcements. First, National Summer Learning Week is July 6th through 11th. This is a time to celebrate and bring awareness to the importance of summer. We hope you all will join us in the celebration. You can add your summer program or event to the event tracker on our Summer Learning Week page. Next, I'll mention that our annual national conference will be November 16th through the 18th in Washington, D.C. Early bird registration is up and open on our website. Stay tuned for announcements about pre-conference workshops and featured speakers. And be sure to stay connected by following NSLA on social media. for the latest updates and announcements. Thank you again to all our panelists and to you for joining us today. Enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.